the one who breaks the darkness with a liberating light. Praise the one who frees the prisoners, turning blindness into sight.
Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we get to look at Ezra chapter 3 together. When the 7th month came and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem. Then arose Yeshua, the son of Jozadak, and with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, with his kinsmen. And they built the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set the altar in its place, for fear was on them because of the peoples of the land, and they offered burnt offerings on it to Yahweh, burnt offerings morning and evening. And they kept the feast of booths, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the rule as each day required. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon, and at all the appointed feasts of Yahweh, and the offerings of everyone who made a free will offering to Yahweh. From the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to Yahweh. But the foundation of the temple of Yahweh was not yet laid. So they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food, drink, and oil to the Sidonians and the Tyrians, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the grant that they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. Now in the 2nd year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the 2nd month, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Yeshua the son of Jozadak made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of Yahweh. And Yeshua with his sons and his brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, the sons of Judah, together supervised the workmen in the house of God, along with the sons of Henadad and the Levites, their sons and brothers. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of Yahweh, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise Yahweh according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to Yahweh. For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great joy when they praised Yahweh, because the foundation of the house of Yahweh was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. This is the word of the Lord. A couple of days ago, if you're following along here with the book of Ezra, I encouraged you to consider, as a family together, what should the Israelites have done first? When Cyrus set them free, when he released them from their captivity and sent them home to Jerusalem, what should have been their priority? Here we're going to see hints at what wasn't their priority. So the chapter begins by mentioning it's 7 months now since their return, and they've so far just been in their own towns. In the first part of our text today, at that 7-month point, they finally decide to do something about their faith. 7 months. They've been in captivity. They've been in exile for, what was it, 587 to 537, so 50 full years. And that exile, by God's counting of years, that exile is not over yet. It is not over until the temple is complete. So the exile continues in that sense. And that's coming from the idea of what the temple actually is. We'll get to that in the second part. But they're going to start with the altar for burnt offerings. So you have Jeshua, or Yeshua, whose name means he saves, and then you have Zerubbabel. So you have the priests that are gathering together, the Levites. They want to do this, and so they build an altar to offer burnt offerings on. Could be a good conversation point to talk about what the purpose is for the burnt offering. If you're interested, you could go back to the beginning of the book of Leviticus. The first several chapters deal with these different types of offerings that people made to the Lord and what those offerings entailed, why they did them, those kinds of things. So, offerings were often done for the sake of forgiveness of sins. Now, as you talk about what these are for, that would be the right reason to have built the altar. But we can see from the very next verse, verse 3, they set the altar in its place, for fear was on them because of the peoples of the land. Israel, Judah here is driven to build the altar not for the sake of God has given this thing to them to do, or even because God offers them forgiveness in this place. They're doing it as I want to say literal, but they're doing it as a very scripted means to protect themselves. If we just show ourselves faithful to God, He will protect us from our enemies. That's the mindset here. They're terrified that they're going to be destroyed again. And so they're not doing this for the right reason. I hope you're following with that. I hope that made some sense. Instead of trusting in the Lord straight out, instead of trusting Him and asking Him for forgiveness, they're building this altar out of fear, out of worry, out of anxiety. Now, there is a bit of trust in that, right? There's an element there that they did say that, well, they didn't say it in the text, but to build this thing even out of fear does show that they think it's going to do something. They think God is going to act. So there is a little trust, there is a little faith there. It's just misguided at this point. It's misdirected. The first thing that they celebrate with that new altar is the Feast of Booths. You can read about the Feast of Booths in Numbers chapter 28, verses 11 through 15. It is also called the Feast of Tabernacles. It had really two purposes. The first, one of those two ideas, is that it's a harvest celebration. So we would look at this as probably September, October timeframe on our calendar. The weather is changing. You're bringing in your harvest for the year. This is a time of rejoicing. You're thanking the Lord for His gifts. You're thanking Him for providing. The other part of the Feast of Booths, however, and why it's booths, is connected to the 40 years in the wilderness. As God brought His people up out of slavery in Egypt, they then wandered because of their rebellion, because of their faithlessness. They wander for 40 years in the wilderness, and they don't have homes of their own. So they're living in booths. They're living in tents made by hand. And that really is why this is a harvest celebration. It connects then, it takes that remembrance of their rebellion and what that had caused, and it connects that to God's faithfulness and how He gives them the promised land. He gives them a place that they can call home, a place where they can permanently settle themselves, a place where they can have homes, build homes, and live in them, where they have fields that they can plant and reap. That's the celebration of the Feast of Booths. You can read about the other ones as well. The books of the Pentateuch cover these different feasts and festivals and new moons and all those things pretty well. If you have a Lutheran Study Bible, page 200 is really helpful, as it puts them all side by side and kind of tells you what they're all about, when all these things would have happened. Useful page. Verse 6. So they've started these celebrations now, but the foundation of the temple of Yahweh was not yet laid. That's a problem. They recognize the problem, so that's good, and they begin the work. They start sending for supplies, cedars from Lebanon, So Tyre and Sidon get mentioned there. Tyre and Sidon are port cities, and Tyre especially known for its role as a merchant in that whole region around the Mediterranean Sea. Very wealthy city because of that. At least they were before God brought about judgment upon them as well. The reminder in that verse 7, that God has used Cyrus for this. Even Cyrus, the king of Persia, is helping to pay for the rebuilding of the temple of God. We get to verse 8. This is the second year, and it's the second month. So, 13 months, if you wanted to look at it from that sense. But their calendar is a little different, actually. 10-month calendar instead of our 12-month calendar. So I guess this is the 11th month, would be the right way to say that. Anyway, they still haven't even begun work. So 4 months ago, they had requested supplies, and now here we are. They still haven't begun the work. You can see the trouble. There's no rush in building the temple. So what's the problem here? What's the purpose of the temple? That's a good conversation to have as a family. If you're not familiar with this one, the temple is the house of God. It is the seat. It is his throne in the midst of his people. So if you read the depiction of the tabernacle that you can find in the latter parts of the book of Exodus, you get the description of all the things in the tabernacle, which is the portable version of the eventual temple. But the one thing that goes into the inner room, the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, is the Ark of the Covenant. And we often think about the Ark as a box, which in part, in fairness, it is a box. It opens and they put stuff inside of it. This is a good trivia question for your children. What was inside of the Ark? And so you've got the jar of manna to remember what they had eaten in the wilderness. You've got the staff of Aaron, which had flowered and budded and produced almonds overnight. That was God showing that the tribe of Levi was the tribe for being the priestly tribe, and more specifically that Aaron had been selected to be the first chief priest, high priest. And then you had the 2 stone tablets bearing the 10 commandments, all inside of that ark. But when you actually look at the description of the ark, you learn that it's not just a box. In fact, the lid of such a box is called the mercy seat. The ark is described for us as being a throne. It's a chair. It's a throne. You think of a chair made out of gold. I mean, that's impressive. So this is God's throne, literally in the midst of his people. As they encamped themselves when they were wandering in the wilderness, they would pitch the tent, the tabernacle first, and they would get that all set up. And then the 12 tribes would camp themselves, 3 tribes to the north, 3 to the west, 3 to the south, 3 to the east. God was literally, his presence in that holy of holy place was in the midst of his people. From an aerial view, if you draw this out, that's what it looks like. He's right there in the middle of them. And so then in Jerusalem, when they finally build the temple, which is King Solomon, the third Israelite king who does this, the temple has that same function. The Ark of the Covenant is brought inside, and this becomes this is the capital city of the nation. This is the new place where God is dwelling among his people. And so for them to return to Judah and Jerusalem and from the exile and not focus on rebuilding the temple is a grand tragedy. This is the house of God. It is his presence in the midst of them. For them not to want to have the temple back at this point in history is an indication of a faithlessness. They don't care if God is present with them or not. Now, obviously, we see in this chapter they're starting to care again, but it was laziness of faith. And we're going to see that problem persist as we continue to read Ezra in the days to come. So they begin the work here in the second section. They have the foundation built, and verse 10, you get the celebration beginning already. The priests with their vestments, their garments on, are blowing trumpets. The Levites, the sons of Asaph, who was one of the singers, they have their cymbals, they're making music. According to the directions of David, king of Israel, you can find similar language in 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verses 4 to 6, giving us these ideas of these different positions among the Levites. Now, in 2 Chronicles 5:13, you would see this what they praise God with, these words, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel, it also bears a striking similarity to a number of the Psalms. Several Psalms use this kind of language, including Psalm 136, verse 1, and that would have been their hymnal at the time. So they're used to singing these things. Verse 12, though, a point of contrast. The people who had seen the original temple, instead of shouting for joy with the younger generations, they begin to weep because it's not even close. So not just the laziness of faith we were talking about, not caring if God was there in their presence. Now, as they move forward and actually doing it, that sense of holiness and the grand, exquisite nature of that first temple, which by the accounting of Scripture, modern economists estimate that first temple was worth a couple $1 billion worth of today's money. So a picture for you there. And we saw some donations already in this book and in the last chapter to the work of the Lord's house, and those were totaling in the millions. So it's a fraction. It's just a part of what the original had been. And so you see the weeping because of that. Now, both of those noises together, the shouts for joy and the shouts of grief, cause a commotion that can be heard from a long ways off, which is almost evangelical in the sense then that neighboring nations who heard that from far off, if it reached their ears, or even neighboring communities, even random shepherds out in their fields, whoever heard it would want to know what that noise was, and it would have given a chance potentially for those conversations about who God is and why we're doing this thing. So we'll see how this continues to play out in the chapters to come.
Let us praise the Word incarnate, Christ who suffered in our place. Jesus died and rose victorious, that we may know God by grace. Let us sing for